The orange cat discovered the dog with a stomach injury. What happened next surprised everyone. "Doctor, is there any hope?" Harold's voice broke despair, filling him as he looked at little Buddy lying still. Dr. Carter shook his head, his eyes heavy. "Honestly, Harold, with this condition, only a miracle or something more extraordinary than a miracle can save Buddy." What extraordinary thing happened? And why did Rusty the cat's actions leave everyone stunned? Subscribe, like, and listen to the whole touching story to discover the secret. The first sound was a high-pitched, frantic yowl slicing through the otherwise tranquil late afternoon air of coastal Maine. It wasn't the usual cautious meow Harold Pendleton had grown accustomed to hearing from the elusive orange stray he'd tentatively named Rusty. This was a sound raw with terror and something else: fury. Harold, a man of 70, whose movements were usually measured, felt a jolt of unease that quickened his pace. He'd been heading towards the overgrown vacant lot bordering his property, a place where Rusty sometimes lurked, a half-eaten can of tuna in his hand. He pushed through a curtain of tangled sumac and stopped dead. The scene before him was chaotic and brutal. Rusty, his orange fur bristling like a bottle brush back arched, was a spitting, snarling demon. He was small, wiry even, but he stood his ground with the ferocity of a cornered tiger. And in front of him, cowering and whimpering, was a tiny mud-caked puppy, no bigger than Harold's two hands clasped together. The puppy's belly was a horrifying mess of matted fur and what looked like dark, angry bruises. Towering over this desperate tableau were three figures: teenagers, lanky and careless, one brandishing a thick stick, another a jagged piece of wood. Their laughter, ugly and mocking, echoed in the clearing. "Look at the stupid cat," one jeered, poking the stick towards Rusty, who dodged with surprising agility, hissing a warning that vibrated with pure hatred. "Thinks he's tough." Harold had seen Rusty nearly every day for 6 months, a fleeting orange shadow that would snatch the food left on the porch and vanish. He was the epitome of wary caution, a creature who flinched at sudden movements and kept a calculated distance from any human. To see him now transformed into a miniature gladiator, willingly placing himself between danger and this injured pup, was nothing short of astounding. The orange cat was trembling. Harold could see it even from a distance, a fine tremor running through his tensed body, but he didn't back down an inch. He was a shield of fur and fury. The youths advanced, and the one with the stick raised it higher. Rusty let out another blood-curdling shriek, and Harold, his heart pounding, finally found his voice. Harold Pendleton had retired to the small, picturesque town of Northport, Maine, seeking the quiet rhythm of coastal life after a career as an accountant in Boston. His days were simple, tending his small garden, reading and taking long, contemplative walks along the rocky shoreline. At 70, he was a man of routine and quiet observation. His wife, Martha, had passed 5 years prior, and the silence in his clapboard house was often profound. It was during one of his porch-sitting afternoons about 6 months ago that he first saw the orange cat, a flash of ginger disappearing into the hydrangeas. Gradually, Harold began leaving out scraps of food. The cat was painfully thin, its movements furtive, its amber eyes wide with a deep, ingrained suspicion. It would only approach the food when Harold was safely inside, and even then it ate quickly, constantly scanning its surroundings. Harold, respecting its fear, simply continued the ritual, speaking softly to the empty space where the cat had been. He named him Rusty, a simple, unassuming name for a creature that seemed to want nothing more than to remain invisible. Rusty never allowed Harold to get close. A sudden movement, a door opening too quickly, and he'd be gone, a blur of orange vanishing into the undergrowth. Harold understood. This was a cat that had learned life's harsher lessons. Still, a fragile, unspoken understanding had developed between them. Rusty knew food would appear, and Harold found a quiet satisfaction in providing for this wild, independent spirit. The inciting incident, the disruption to this carefully maintained equilibrium, occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. Harold had put out Rusty's usual portion of wet food, a particular brand of salmon pâté he'd discovered the cat favored. An hour later, the food remained untouched. This was unusual. Rusty, despite his wariness, was punctual when it came to meal times. A knot of anxiety tightened in Harold's chest. He called out, "Rusty kitty!" Only the rustle of leaves in the sea breeze answered. Concerned, Harold decided to take a walk around the perimeter of his property, extending his search to the vacant lot next door. A tangle of wild roses, overgrown grass, and discarded remnants of forgotten lives. It was a place Rusty often used as a thoroughfare. As he neared the densest part of the lot, he heard at that first uncharacteristic yowl of pure distress. It was what propelled him forward, pushing through the thorny bushes, his earlier anxiety now morphing into a more urgent fear, leading him directly to the shocking scene of Rusty, the timid stray locked in a terrifying standoff. After Harold's enraged shouts and determined advance had sent the jeering teenagers scattering like startled crows, he rushed forward. The small puppy lay whimpering, its eyes squeezed shut. Its breathing was shallow, and the dark, ugly bruising on its exposed belly looked alarmingly severe. Rusty, the adrenaline still coursing through him, remained protectively over the pup, though the aggressive hissing had subsided into low, anxious growls. He was trembling violently now, his small body shaking from either fear or exertion, or perhaps both. Harold reached down slowly, speaking in what he hoped was a soothing tone. "It's okay, Rusty. They're gone. You brave boy." To his surprise, Rusty didn't bolt. He looked up at Harold, his amber eyes wide and filled with a desperate, almost pleading terror, before nudging the injured puppy gently with his nose. It was a clear, unmistakable appeal for help. Harold's first instinct was to get the puppy to a veterinarian and fast. He gently scooped up the small, limp form. It was lighter than he expected, and its whimpers were heartbreakingly faint. "We need to go, Rusty," he said, looking at the orange cat who was now pacing anxiously around his feet. "Come on." To his astonishment, as he turned to leave the vacant lot, Rusty followed, sticking close to his heels, a silent, worried shadow. The drive to Dr. Emily Carter's veterinary clinic on the edge of town was tense. The puppy lay on an old towel on the passenger seat, and Rusty sat on the floor beneath it, occasionally letting out a soft, troubled meow. Harold kept glancing over his heart, aching for the tiny creature. Dr. Carter, a woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and capable hands, took one look at the puppy, and her expression became grave. "Oh, you poor little thing," she murmured gently, examining the pup. Harold explained the situation, including Rusty's extraordinary defense. "He's in bad shape, Harold," Dr. Carter said after a thorough examination. "Severe abdominal trauma. Looks like he's been kicked repeatedly. There's likely internal bleeding. His chances They're not good, I'm afraid. She named the puppy Buddy on the spot, a small act of hope in a grim situation. As Dr. Carter worked to stabilize Buddy, administering pain medication and fluids, Harold mentioned Rusty's uncharacteristic behavior and his own long-standing distant relationship with the stray. "He's always been so timid," Harold explained. "I've never seen him like that. It was like he was protecting his own." Dr. Carter, while one of her assistants tended to Buddy, turned her attention to Rusty, who had remained in the examination room, huddled near the door, watching everything with wide, anxious eyes. "Let's take a look at you too, Hero," she said softly. Rusty flinched when she reached for him, but Harold's reassuring voice seemed to calm him slightly. As Dr. Carter gently palpated Rusty's sides and abdomen, her fingers paused. "Well, now this is interesting," she said, her brow furrowed. She carefully parted Rusty's fur. "He's got some old healed scars here. Faint, but they're definitely there. And the pattern? It's consistent with old blunt force trauma. Specifically, Harold, it looks like Rusty himself may have been a victim of similar abuse in the past. Kicked just like little Buddy." Harold stared at the vet, then at Rusty, a wave of understanding and profound sadness washing over him. Rusty's fierce, desperate defense of Buddy wasn't just random heroism. It was born from a shared trauma, a deep, instinctual recognition of suffering. The timid stray had seen his own past horrors being inflicted on another innocent creature and had found a courage he probably didn't know he possessed. The complications mounted. Buddy would need surgery if he was to have any chance, and even then survival was far from guaranteed. The cost would be significant, a serious consideration for a retiree on a fixed income. Yet looking at Rusty, who had crept closer to the table where Buddy lay and was now tentatively sniffing the puppy's still form, Harold felt a growing resolve. He agreed to the surgery. Dr. Carter and her team worked for hours. Harold waited, pacing the small waiting room. Rusty, surprisingly, was allowed to stay in a quiet corner of the treatment area, his presence seemingly a small comfort even to the busy staff. The surgery was difficult. Buddy was incredibly fragile. Afterwards, he was placed in an incubator, hooked up to monitors and IV lines. Rusty, when allowed to see him, refused to leave the side of the incubator. He lay curled up as close as he could get, his soft purr, a low, continuous rumble, occasionally reaching a paw through the bars to gently touch Buddy's tiny, bandaged body. The clinic staff were amazed. They'd seen animal bonds before, but this was something special. News of the incident began to filter through the small town. Harold, a private man, found himself the subject of curious glances and hushed conversations at the local grocery store. Some were touched by the story of the brave orange cat. Others, particularly those whose teenage sons might have been involved, were dismissive or even subtly hostile, muttering about overblown stories and just a stray cat and a mutt. Harold ignored them, his focus solely on the two small lives hanging in the balance. The emotional toll, coupled with the financial strain, began to weigh heavily on him. For 2 days, Buddy hovered between life and death. Each phone call from Dr. Carter was a fresh wave of anxiety for Harold. The puppy was fighting, she'd say, but he was so weak. The internal damage had been extensive. Rusty remained a steadfast sentinel at the clinic, eating little, sleeping fitfully beside Buddy's incubator, his presence a quiet testament to unwavering loyalty. Harold visited several times a day, his heart clenching each time he saw the tiny, unresponsive form. On the third morning, Dr. Carter called Harold. Her voice was gentle, but her tone was somber. "Harold," she began, "I think you need to come down. Buddy, he's taken a turn for the worse overnight. His breathing is more labored, his vitals are dropping. I'm so sorry, but I think we need to prepare ourselves. It might be time to consider letting him go peacefully." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. Euthanasia. He'd known it was a possibility, a probability even, but hearing it spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. He drove to the clinic, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind a turmoil of grief and helplessness. He found Dr. Carter waiting for him, her expression compassionate but weary. She led him to the quiet room where Buddy's incubator stood. Rusty was there, of course, pressed against the clear plastic, his eyes fixed on the puppy. Buddy looked even smaller, almost translucent, his tiny chest barely rising and falling. "He's not responding to treatment anymore," Dr. Carter said softly, placing a comforting hand on Harold's arm. "He's suffering, Harold. Sometimes the kindest thing." Harold nodded, tears welling in his eyes. He knew she was right. He didn't want the little creature to suffer anymore. He leaned over the incubator, his voice thick with emotion. "Goodbye, little fella," he whispered. "You fought so hard." As he straightened up, ready to give Dr. Carter his consent, something extraordinary happened. Rusty, who had been watching Harold intently, let out a distinct, urgent meow. Not a yowl of distress, but a clear, almost demanding sound. He then stretched a paw through the bars of the incubator and gently, insistently tapped Buddy's nose. Once, twice. He looked up at Harold, then back at Buddy, meowing again, a strange communicative trill. And then the miracle. Buddy's ear twitched, just a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker. His eyes, which had been closed, fluttered slightly. He let out the faintest whimper, a sound so soft Harold almost missed it. Then, incredibly, he tried to lift his head, a minuscule movement, but a movement nonetheless. Harold gasped. Dr. Carter stared, her professional composure momentarily forgotten. "Did you see that?" Harold whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Rusty meowed again, a low, rumbling purr starting in his chest, and nudged Buddy's nose again. This time, Buddy's eyes opened a fraction, and he seemed to try to focus on the orange cat. It was the faintest spark of life, but it was there. A turning point. Harold looked at Dr. Carter, his heart pounding with a sudden, defiant hope. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Not yet. We're not giving up on him yet. He's still fighting. Rusty knows it." Dr. Carter, visibly moved by the scene, by Rusty's unwavering conviction, and that tiny spark from Buddy, hesitated for only a moment. A small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Harold," she said, a new determination in her own voice. "Let's give him another chance. We'll try a different combination of supportive care. We'll keep fighting with him." Harold felt a surge of profound gratitude, not just to the vet, but to the small, battered orange cat who had refused to give up, whose fierce love had seemingly called Buddy back from the brink. He had come to the clinic prepared to say goodbye, but Rusty had shown him that sometimes, even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope and the unwavering belief of a devoted friend could change everything. This was no longer just about saving a puppy. It was about honoring an incredible, inexplicable bond. The decision to continue Buddy's treatment, fueled by that fragile moment of response, marked the beginning of an intensely emotional and uncertain period. Dr. Carter and her team threw themselves into Buddy's care with renewed vigor, adjusting medications, monitoring his vitals around the clock, and providing constant supportive therapy. The clinic, usually a place of routine appointments and occasional emergencies, became focused on the fate of the tiny battered puppy and his extraordinary feline guardian. Harold found himself practically living at the clinic. He'd arrive early in the morning, bringing Rusty fresh food and water. Though the cat still ate sparingly, his attention almost solely on Buddy, and stay late into the evening sitting quietly by the incubator, speaking softly to both animals. He learned the rhythms of the clinic, the hushed tones of the staff during critical moments, the small sighs of relief when Buddy made it through another difficult hour. Rusty's vigil was nothing short of remarkable. He rarely strayed more than a few feet from Buddy's side. When the incubator door was opened for treatment, Rusty would peer in anxiously, sometimes reaching a gentle paw to touch Buddy's leg or head. His purr, a constant soothing vibration, seemed to fill the small space around the incubator, a lifeline of sound in the sterile environment. The clinic staff, initially just tolerant of his presence, grew to deeply respect and admire the orange cat. They made sure he had a comfortable bed, fresh water, and spoke to him as if he were a concerned family member, which in a way he was. Nights were the hardest for Harold. He'd go home to his empty house, the silence amplifying his anxieties. He'd lie awake, replaying the events in his mind, the cruelty of the youths, Rusty's astonishing bravery, the horrifying extent of Buddy's injuries, and Rusty's own hidden history of abuse. He thought about the scars Dr. Carter had found, the silent testament to past suffering. It made Rusty's devotion to Buddy all the more poignant. This wasn't just a cat protecting a puppy. It was a survivor refusing to let another victim suffer alone. The financial burden was also a constant worry. The bills were mounting, and while Dr. Carter had been understanding, Harold knew he couldn't sustain this indefinitely. He started dipping into savings he'd earmarked for house repairs, telling himself it was a small price to pay for the chance at a miracle. During these long nights, Harold often found himself thinking about the nature of courage. He had always considered himself a cautious man, not prone to grand gestures. Yet, here he was, deeply entangled in a situation that demanded a kind of faith he hadn't known he possessed. And his inspiration was a small, stray orange cat, a creature who had every reason to be bitter and fearful, but who instead chose fierce, unwavering love. Buddy's progress was agonizingly slow, a series of tiny steps forward, followed by terrifying setbacks. One day, he might open his eyes for a few minutes or weakly lap a bit of formula from a syringe. The next, he might be lethargic, his breathing shallow, sending fresh waves of fear through Harold and the clinic staff. Dr. Carter remained cautiously optimistic, but realistic. "He's still incredibly fragile, Harold," she'd remind him. "His little body has been through so much." Through it all, Rusty remained constant. His presence was a quiet anchor. If Buddy whimpered, Rusty would meow softly in response. If Buddy shivered, Rusty would press himself closer to the incubator as if trying to share his own body heat. He was the first to notice any change in Buddy's condition, his ears perking up, his gaze intensifying. As the days turned into a week, then nearly two, a routine, however precarious, settled in. The dark night of the soul for Harold came one evening when Buddy developed a fever, his breathing becoming ragged. Dr. Carter looked particularly grave. "We're doing everything we can," she said, her voice heavy. Harold sat by the incubator late into the night, watching Rusty, who seemed more agitated than usual, pacing restlessly. The thought that he might lose Buddy after all this, after so much hope and effort, was almost unbearable. He prayed something he hadn't done with such fervor in years, not for a miracle, but for strength, for peace, for whatever outcome was meant to be. He finally went home, exhausted, leaving Rusty to his lonely watch, the weight of the world seemingly on his own frail shoulders. The climax of this emotional journey was fast approaching one way or another. The next morning, Harold woke with a sense of heavy dread. He'd barely slept, the image of Buddy's feverish, struggling form haunting his thoughts. He drove to the clinic, slowly preparing himself for the worst. He expected Dr. Carter to meet him with a somber face to deliver the news he'd been steeling himself against. When he entered the clinic, the atmosphere felt different. Quieter, perhaps, but not with the hush of tragedy. One of the young vet techs, Sarah, saw him, and a small, almost shy smile touched her lips. "Mr. Pendleton?" she said, her voice soft. "Dr. Carter is with Buddy. She asked if you'd go on back." His heart hammered against his ribs. He walked down the familiar corridor, his steps leaden. He paused at the door to the small recovery room, taking a deep breath. This was it. He pushed the door open. Dr. Carter was kneeling beside the incubator, her back to him. But it wasn't her posture that caught his attention. It was Rusty. The orange cat wasn't pressed anxiously against the plastic. He was inside the incubator, curled up beside a small, stirring form. And Buddy was awake. Not just awake, but alert. His eyes, no longer dull and unfocused, were bright. His tiny tail, a mere stump, was giving a series of weak but unmistakable thumps against the bedding. As Harold watched, stunned into silence, Buddy lifted his head, a real definite lift, and nuzzled weakly against Rusty's side. Rusty responded with a loud rumbling purr, a sound of pure, unadulterated contentment, and began to gently groom Buddy's ear. Dr. Carter turned, then a wide, radiant smile transforming her face. "Harold," she said, her voice filled with a joy that mirrored his own dawning disbelief. His fever broke completely during the night. He started responding. He even took some formula from a bottle about an hour ago. Well, just look at him. He's decided he's going to stick around. Harold could only stare, tears streaming freely down his face. It was more than a miracle. It was a testament to resilience, to the incredible power of a bond that defied explanation. The tiny puppy, who had been so close to death, was now looking at him with curious, intelligent eyes, nestled safely against his feline protector. The sight of Rusty, no longer a frantic guardian, but a calm, loving companion curled protectively around the recovering pup, was the most beautiful thing Harold had ever seen. The surprise wasn't just Buddy's survival, it was the undeniable soul-deep connection that had wilted into being orchestrated by a traumatized stray cat who had found his own healing in saving another. Buddy's recovery from that point was astonishingly swift. With Rusty as his constant companion and motivator, he grew stronger each day. He started to eat eagerly, his tiny body slowly filling out. His playful puppy instincts began to emerge, much to Rusty's initial surprise and eventual patient tolerance. The clinic staff celebrated every milestone, and Harold felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. There was never any question about what would happen next. A week later, when Buddy was finally strong enough to leave the clinic, Harold signed the adoption papers for both of them. He paid the veterinary bill a significant sum, but one he now considered the best investment he'd ever made. Leaving the clinic, Buddy nestled in a blanket-lined carrier, and Rusty, for the first time, Harold could recall, willingly allowed Harold to pick him up and place him in the passenger seat of the car. There was no fear in the orange cat's amber eyes, only a calm trust. Life in Harold's quiet clapboard house transformed. The silence was replaced by the happy yips of a growing puppy and the contented purrs of a cat who had finally found his safe harbor. Rusty, no longer the wary, elusive stray, blossomed into an affectionate and confident house cat. He still bore the faint scars of his past, but they no longer defined him. He would often be found curled up beside Buddy, their two small bodies a comforting presence for each other and for Harold. He even allowed Harold to groom him, a previously unimaginable intimacy. Buddy, with his boundless puppy energy, adored Rusty, following him everywhere, initiating clumsy play fights that Rusty usually ended with a dignified retreat to higher ground, though always keeping a watchful eye on his young charge. The story of Harold, Rusty, and Buddy became a cherished local legend in Northport. People who had once been skeptical now greeted Harold with warm smiles and inquiries about those two amazing animals. The vacant lot where their journey began remained overgrown, but for Harold, it was no longer just a patch of weeds. It was a place where courage had been found and an unbreakable bond forged. Harold Pendleton, the quiet retiree, found his days filled with a new purpose and a profound joy. He had opened his home and his heart, and in return, he had received the unwavering loyalty and unconditional love of two remarkable survivors. Watching Rusty and Buddy play in the sun-dappled yard, he knew that sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most extraordinary friendships, and that even the deepest wounds can be healed by courage, compassion, and the quiet miracle of a second chance.